Organized chaos is the way I look at my work in general, but this is also a way we call Cairo. It's a way of referring to Cairo as a chaotic but somehow organized city. So I began my work as a photographer, and very early on I was involved with artists and filmmakers from the Arab region just after the war in Lebanon and around the mid-90s. And together we created and founded the Arab Image Foundation, which today is quite a big institution in the region that focuses on collecting, conserving, and archiving photography since the beginning of photography until the end of the black and white era. Some of the images that are part of the collection are family images and studio photography images. These are really like very random samples, but I think it's important to start with this sort of, you know, the good old time. This is from a studio in Iraq, for example. And the idea was to try and figure out if there was such a thing as Arab photography and a history of Arab photography and a way that Arabs had to look at themselves. We were pretty much drowning into this idea that, you know, the West had looked at the Arab world, but we looked at ourselves. And so under the sort of pressure of Orientalists' views of the Middle East, and by such photographers as, you know, very famous Leonard and Landrock in Egypt, for example, and the sort of image of what people have of Egypt, I thought instead of looking at my own country as Orientalists did, to look at my country from the perspective of people living there. And so this was something that it would never be possible today to picnic on top of Cheops, the pyramid. But I was inspired by this idea of showing a different way of thinking photography and the Middle East, and built very early on in my first, when I moved to Cairo in 97, when I moved back to Cairo from living in France and London, I did this first sort of major work that sort of threw me into the art world, which was taken from a commission by the Fondation Cartier in Paris. They were preparing an exhibition that was looking at the history of photography and how today, in the beginning of the 21st century, how photography and landscape were. What was the relationship between photography and landscape? So I did this piece in a very low-tech kind of way, because in Cairo at the time, and until now actually, there's no real photographic lab or any kind of new technology applied to photography. So this is C41 analog photographs. There's no Photoshop. I always feel the need to say that. It felt natural at the time, but today it seems like people think I've done this in Photoshop. So if you look at the big collage, this is a 3.5 meters by 1.5 meter piece. It's made of 600 photographs that are postcard size. And on the corner here, you see a photograph by Leonard and Landrock, which is basically, I mean, it's the only postcard, the actual real postcard of the work, which refers to this Orientalist view of the desert, but then sort of throws a whole new narrative of picnicking in the desert and being there as a very familiar place rather than a place of adventure and possible death and so on. And the characters that I staged, my friends and some Bedouins, were basically inspired by fairy tales, and the whole sort of mythology of the piece is very much constructed around the idea of the separation of the water and the earth and the sort of emergence of humanity. The next work that I moved into was Sandouk el Dunya, which means the world in a box, which is actually the sort of ancestor to filmmaking, to movies, which is a sort of theatrical Pandora moving box. I'm not sure if it has a name in English, but it would be like a kind of ambulance theater where people, somebody would sort of bring narratives to your door, and you would go as a kid and listen to them in the street and just sit down on the sidewalk and listen to them. So this was called Sandouk el Dunya. And here I'm taking the counterpoint of the previous work and sort of throwing myself into kind of apocalyptic urban landscape, using characters from my childhood and Western as well as Middle Eastern television. So I don't know if you've all seen this Garandizer or remember him even. This is one of the first Transformers in the 80s. And so I sort of inspired myself with manga characters to create a whole narrative around the idea of video games and how video games are themselves inspired by board games. And in this case, I'm using snakes and ladders. Here you have a detail of a fight taking place in a staircase, and I shot everything in my service staircase from my home apartment in Cairo. It was quite funny because it was during Ramadan, and so everybody sort of came to the street underneath and could see it could see us on the balconies, and so all the kids, because there's lots of schools around my house, they were all joining up and trying to get into the building and to come to actually touch the characters. And it was a very amusing interaction with the street because even my neighbors sort of would open the door and say, oh God, this one, oh, I prefer the one from yesterday, so it was this kind of like, okay. And I mean, they were quite outrageous in the middle of a very kind of Cairo environment. This is another detail of the piece. And here there is, in the catalog was a kind of mock-up of the idea of the video game and how you sort of choose your characters and then they fight each other and so on. And so there's, in fact, this is a sort of psychological portrait of a woman in a contemporary city. So each of these characters is actually one character, and they're all sort of collapsed into one with my favorite one, which is the Golden Age, and played by my grandmother. In 2007, I had access and the possibility, because I had that idea a few years before, but I couldn't really do it in Cairo, but I had access to this possibility of applying this new recent technology that was developed in Belgium to make tapestries from digital files, from digital stills. And so what I did is photographed the original collage, which is made of 1,000 photographs, edited themselves from about 10,000 photographs that I took, and stitched the photographs together back into a reproduction of the collage. And then that image was then digitally woven through quite an elaborate machine. So here you see details of how this work becomes transformed into an actual material, and silk and wool and a mix of different materials. This is another detail. And this is the machine. So you see how both of my collages became tapestries. That's the scale of it, just to give you a sense of. And then I had a bit of a overdose of photographs, so I sort of moved away from shooting in analog and printing these massive, I would come back with suitcases of prints from the lab and spent days and days and days editing them. But I sort of got kind of overdosed with it and decided to move into using photography and sort of, get out of the frame of the photograph and also use the qualities and the possibilities that were given to me in Cairo. So very extraordinarily, you have no access to a lot of technology and a lot of modernity, but on the other hand, you have people who do things with their hands, and you have people who And you can access a hospital, for example, and go and do x-rays of whatever and have, because the doctor is a friend of somebody in your family, and so you can sort of do things that would be very complicated to do in different contexts. And so I built my first installation, which is, I know you don't think in meters, but 29 meters is pretty big. So this is the circumference of the piece seen from above. And it uses an Islamic star, which is the expansion. In Sufism, it's the expansion of the breath of the compassionate. And here I'll stop talking a little bit so I can show you a little taste of where I come from. The sound is very low on this, but I'm not sure if we can adjust it here. So this is 2002. What's going on? Collapsed. Where were we? Sorry about that. Hope it works. Oh, that's why my file must be. No, it's not. No, let me see. If I pass the bit that's not happy. Oh, oh, okay. So it cut. So it didn't convert the whole video. Okay, no problem. We'll move on. Here you can see what it looks like at the end, and it's basically a light box with. I'm sorry about this. It's a light box with lights that turn on and off. So they sort of animate the images like in a magic lantern. So the narrative, you have to walk around to see the narrative, and it's a continuous narrative. So the images are images of plastic dolls that look like fake Barbies, but one of them is pregnant, and so her tummy pops up, and that's for Suvi today. So her tummy sort of opens up, and then the baby crawls out and becomes an adult, and life repeats itself. And so it was a sort of metaphor in 2002 when the Intifada started. It was a way for me to kind of do a metaphor of how history repeats itself and how peace, war sort of follow each other and in a continuous and never-ending sort of circle. It was also a sort of way of referring to the overpopulation of Egypt and as a kind of also staging the fanus from the, kind of in parallel to this very important landmark, which is the Muhammad Ali Mosque, which everybody knows and which has this huge lantern in it. My next videos will work, I hope. What is this? Which one is that? Hold on. Oh, that's another one. Okay. No, we don't want you. So what I've done is really, I've tried to focus on selecting works that would make sense in terms of the work I'm doing here, but also in terms of how living in Egypt and having made that decision very intentionally, I've sort of always played with this possibility of bringing very kind of direct and simple materials with the possibility of using new technologies or trying to work with this, trying to transform photography and narratives with other tools than the ones that were that I had access to in Cairo. So here, this is an image of an installation of a work called Shish Kebab. So she's looking at a screen inside the box, and it's like a music box. So when you open the box, the screen, the film starts, and it's like a ballerina running around Tokyo. And when you close the box at any time, then the music stops, just like a traditional music box. So this work was, I'm showing it here because it was 2003, and it was during my fellowship in Japan, and I had never done, I didn't have a mobile phone by then. It was still the beginning of mobile phones, but I overnight got a mobile phone, like plastic Japanese mobile phone, totally complicated to use. But the thing about being in Japan at the time was that they already had internet on their phones. I'm not sure when it came in the US that you could actually have. So when did it start? Do you remember?
It started with BlackBerries, probably about 2000.
Right. So in Europe, it was not yet the case, and definitely not in Egypt. So it was quite funny to be in Tokyo and to have this toy as part of one of my ways of collecting images and stories. So I completely, I just documented every single second of my life. So these are those, you can see them here. So this is one of them. So this was made with mobile phones. And the funny thing is I found a system because you couldn't connect the phone, which is of course Japanese technology, to my computer, which was not Japanese technology. So I had to find a way to download those photos. So when I would take the metro, I would write an email to myself and attach maximum, I could attach 2 photos. And so I would attach 2 photos, and then when I would arrive at a platform where there was internet, I would send an email to myself. So I did this with 3,000 photographs, which was kind of insane. But I think it's kind of funny to think about this today and to think that this is totally normal for us today, but it wasn't then. I even had a crazy conversation with the curator that was my advisor in Japan, who was like, what are you going to do with this stuff? It's super low resolution. You can't do anything with it. I was like, I don't know. I just think I have to do this. So this is what sort of comes out of it. And then at that time, it was also the beginning of the Iraq War. So it was like being submerged with screens and relationship to this kind of very clinical way of looking at reality, and to constantly be looking at a screen, whether it was my computer to look at the news or whether I was in Shibuya in the middle of Tokyo, where a screen is reality and every building is every facade of the buildings are screens. And so this whole relationship also of how wars represented and how, how random it is also, how unimportant it was in Japan, because suddenly also I wasn't in the center of the world as I was always used to. Being living in Europe or living in the Middle East always gave me the sense that, Europe and what the West is always this kind of, you see the world from that point of view. And suddenly in Tokyo, it's like no one even knew what Iraq was or where it was, and they didn't really care, to be honest. So it was this very interesting sort of shift of how cultures become kind of alienated or not. This is a view from the top of the museum. And then from this work also, and this is very interesting for me to show this here because I think it's kind of the anchor to what I'm doing here, is this piece called Roba Vecchia. Roba Vecchia in Italian means ragman. It comes from the presence of the Italian community in Egypt in the 50s and until the 50s, and it's still used today. As you know, in countries like India or Egypt or Africa, you always have someone who has a job that sort of walks around the street and announces, either sells something or buys something or does or sharpens knives, or these kind of very tiny, very niche sort of works. And Roba Vecchia is the ragman, is the man who passes through the streets and collects all junk. And so this work was done with, I was interested in showing how, after this experience of like massively producing nonsensical images really of Japan, 50 hours of videos and like thousands of photographs of my mobile phone and so on, I wanted to sort of, deal with digital trash. So what is all this? What do we do with all this digital production? And so the notion of digital trash, as well as the notion of how we perceive history, was very much what I was trying to answer in this work. And this is a view from the other side of the kaleidoscope, the life-size kaleidoscope. It shows how instead of using video, which would normally be the way of installing a work in an art context and having it loop and again, so whoever comes will sort of catch it at whenever it happens. I really wanted to keep the randomness of the kaleidoscope and how the kaleidoscope is never creating the same pattern. So the sort of archetypal structure is there, but the pattern is always different. And our experience of life is always different. Although we're all exposed to similar things, we tend to understand them, experience them in different ways. So I wanted to look at this, this notion of how we tell stories. And I sort of found a text by Benjamin that was describing a little bit the kaleidoscope as he was using the analogy of the optical tool, the kaleidoscope as an optical tool, and as a way of looking at history and how, in fact, we write history with the leftovers of history. And so I used my digital trash to sort of kind of recreate this environment where you get all these stories again and again, but never the same way twice. And so this was my first use of working with coding and computers and avoiding sort of the traditional way of making a video. And so my cousin happily was a coder in Copenhagen, and we worked together via Skype and PCs and Mac. And it was also quite funny because at the time it was like almost impossible to even connect on the internet. And this is the same work shown in Dubai in the first art fair that now is very established. So the outside is mirrors and the inside is mirrors, and so people go in and become part of the piece. So here you have an Emirati experiencing it. And this is it's a very difficult piece to photograph because you're photographing mirrors, so it's never really focused. But in here you can have a little sense of how it sort of moves. So these are just samples of moments within the movement of the images inside the structure. There's no sound, so no worries. So this is the back of the work, and from the other side, people could enter the kaleidoscope. And so the way the code worked is that it went from one set of selected images and then chose randomly 12 of them and then threw them out as you saw in that grid, and then moved on to the next series of images and again selected another 12 and so on and so forth. Today my videos are not happy, so never mind, you get the idea. And so that way of telling stories and using archive as well as this whole relationship to history that we have was very much already anchored in this work in a much more kind of in this way of abundance and this era of digital that we were in, while also in Egypt being perceived. It was very interesting how it was perceived, because the day before the opening of that work, there was a sandstorm. And so the whole, the 21 mirrors were covered in dust and sand, and it was a total disaster. And so it was really like a whole race to kind of clean everything up and make it work by the time the opening would start. And it really looked like this kind of diamond that was like digged from under the desert, and this sort of Stargate that really had nothing to do there. It was such a contrast between what's happening in the street with all these mechanicians and people working the cars and so on, and this environment. So it was quite beautiful. Here I'm like looking a little bit also in the context. So all of this was happening in the years of between the 90s and until the end of the era of Mubarak's dictatorship. This is an image I kept because I removed this work, but I kept this image just to give you the kind of also a little bit of a reference to what does happen in Cairo and where Egypt is at and how pretty dramatic some of its aspects are. And this work I did as these were a series of photographs that I took to document the architectural patterns of the suburbs of Cairo, the slums, that are called informal architecture because they're built illegally on agricultural land, and they basically have destroyed all of the agricultural land. Urbanists say that by the 20s there won't be any left, and it's a real environmental disaster. There is no amenities in those areas, and they really have this very specific kind of dynamics to it socially, politically, and so on. And these cities actually constitute 65% of Cairo, so they are Cairo. And so these photographs became a book, but what I was doing was to really understand how these things were being built and what was the patterns that were being used in terms of that kind of system. Was there a system to how this was built? As I had an idea for the Cairo International Biennial to actually build a tower in the center of a military base, which is the Opera Grounds in the middle of Cairo, which is probably the most expensive piece of real estate in the country. And so the subject of the biennial was the others. And given how the government wasn't paying attention to all these areas and all these people and really to nobody, I thought that would be a really interesting way of responding to this biennial. And if I'm going to be part of it, I'm going to be part of it as also making a point of using the space and for what it means. So I did this work really in relationship to what this space was, how loaded it was politically. And so this is a 2 stories high tower that uses all these details of how these places are built, and it's a kind of collage of photographs in a way, or it's even, some people told me it looks like a tapestry because of how the bricks are sort of woven. And inside was, you can see in the background, the Opera House. And you can imagine also the kind of problems I had building that in that space, with all the security guards sort of like arresting my workers because of course they're like not supposed to be there because they're poor people. But then the workers do live in these areas, so they absolutely loved it and became completely part of it and kind of embraced this monument to the poor, as someone called it when the opening started. And so inside the tower was a donkey symphony, which is, I know sounds funny, but it actually is quite sad. And it was a symphony inspired by Gorecki's symphony from the 70s in 3 movements, very classical piece, except that we have a sort of dialogue between sopranos and donkey brays. And it's sort of at times it's kind of funny, and at times makes you cry, and people would come in and never go out. And so I also became the cafe of the opera ground, where you could smoke the shisha and get your coffee and get your sandwich or your book and hang out in the space. And one day I came and I found a massive ashtray full of cigarettes, and I asked the security guard, what the hell happened here, and I could see onions, peels, and like all kinds of stuff had happened. And he said, well, the director of the opera house came with somebody and they just had a meeting for 3 hours. They smoked all these cigarettes. So it was quite, it was a very, very, it was quite an extraordinary time. It was also at the end of the regime, so looking back and in retrospect to this work, it was a way of saying, we have to address issues here, and they're not being addressed. So this was quite a, I wasn't sure what would happen from this work. So then in 2012, I actually played the Donkey Symphony with, I have to give you a copy, with the Camera Orchestra of Kiev, which was probably one of my biggest nightmares in my life. As the Russian chief orchestra was a fantastic man, but extraordinarily stubborn, and hated my donkeys, and hated me for wanting him to play with this beautiful classic music with my donkey brays. So it was pretty, we almost canceled the whole thing, and then these 5 ladies came in and they started to play from the score, the soprano part of the piece, and we were just all in tears, and it was quite magical. So we said, okay, we're going to put up with this and just do it. So that was quite an experience too. And here I played the symphony in a silo in the Art Omai residency last summer. And it was beautiful because the next day it was also raining, and so you had the sound of the rain with the sound of the donkeys and the sopranos. I mean, it was all very special. In the period of the uprising, and when Tahrir Square became this international, the eye of the world went on us. This was, again, I repeat myself, sorry for those who were here last week, but it was the most documented event in the 21st century, with as many people, as many cameras, and maybe more cameras than people, and without counting also how much the press actually covered this event and so on. So here you have a sense of how crazy the relationship we have today to mobile phones and to making images and stories. And so very quickly on, when the revolution started, the reason why I went down was this video. Sorry. You shot the... They're screaming, courageous, courageous. So this is the second day of the revolution. This is the 26th of January. And for the first time, the people, were more... the presence of the people was bigger than the presence of the police in the square. And so this video I saw was one of the first viral videos from the revolution. And the kind of confrontation between this man standing up and not moving and the cannon, the water cannon, was a very shocking kind of moment, for it was very much resonating with Tiananmen and the man standing in front of the tank in '89. It was actually titled Tiananmen Cairo Courage, this video. And that was the reason why I went down. And I'll stop it here. That was the reason why I went down, but it was also what triggered my interest in the kind of iconography and relationship to history, as well as to what was happening in the street and trying to make sense of it. So there was a lot of reason for me to get kind of carried away with starting this archive. So I didn't really do it because I had the idea of making an archive. I did it because it was a way of coping with and making sense of what I was part of. But I also very quickly understood this was becoming quite a big enterprise in itself, and I had to start to be methodical about it and organized and really like kind of take it to another level. So it's been growing. It's a project that's been growing since 2011. So I've come here with this project. Now it's called Vox Populi Archiving a Revolution in the Digital Age. The first, and that whole period sort of is full of projects. So the first project is, and this resonates with the work Halsey showed a bit earlier, as we started working together on this, how to deal with the, with voices and sounds and music from the revolution. And the first project that came out of the archive was a very immediate and very blunt kind of project that was born overnight. I had all this material that I had downloaded from YouTube, and I knew very much in my gut that, although it was called the Facebook Revolution, half the country didn't have internet and didn't watch all this stuff, and we're still under the kind of propaganda of Egyptian television. So with somebody in the square, I talked about doing a cinema, and then we just I built at the townhouse, this gallery I work with, I built this very rudimentary screen, which you see on the side. And the funny thing is, behind the screen is actually a printed image of the view from the top of Tahrir, so it's like this crazy being there, but also that image is also like sort of transparent. And that cinema was a way of sharing footage of the revolution that most people probably didn't have access to. But it was also a way of archiving more the revolution. So people came, they took, and we spent hours and nights, filling people's USB sticks with the footage that we were showing, and them giving us their footage of whatever fights and battles they had participated in or witnessed. And so we had a tent in the middle of the Sanaya, which is the center of the roundabout, where we collected all this material. But it was also a way of communicating about the revolution and discussing where we were at, and all kinds of things happened. So it was quite a vibrant place. The first after the Tahrir cinema, which was dismantled by the army, and things started to get really complicated, and less people were going to the square, and the revolution sort of slowed down, I tried to digest everything I had collected so far. And so the first kind of narrative that really comes out of all this stuff is this piece that I did, Alone Together in Media Res. Again, I used the same system as with the kaleidoscope, where I worked with a coder to randomly, and this was for me a kind of way of also interpreting what our relationship to internet is, and how we all have a very different relationship to it. We can all Google the same word, but we won't get the same answers. So you get what you get according to what you've searched before, rather than according to a pattern of archive that's going to be just given to you. So really our interpretation, our relationship, our understanding of history becomes a completely different one. And so the way the piece works is that there's a linear, well, there's a narrative. Linear, I don't know, but there's a narrative that's always, that stays, that's always the same. So whoever sees the piece will see the same narrative. But what works next to the narrative and the images that come up are a little bit like in the kaleidoscope. They are chosen through a series of folders that are tagged. And then from these folders, random number like 15 or 12 again, are being pulled out and accompany the narrative. So there's this kind of system of, different experience that we may have. So I won't play the whole thing. I'll cut you in the middle too, but you can see that on the internet. It's called Alone Together in Media Res, and it's available. I mean, there's a small expert that's available on the net, but this is a little bit like the
Explain yourself. I'm afraid I can't explain myself, sir, because I'm not myself, you know.
I do not know.
But I can't put it any more clearly, for it isn't clear to me.
You. Who are you?
And to find out who you are, you have to inquire. You are the story of mankind. Which is really, if you really see that, it gives you tremendous vitality, energy, beauty, love. Because it's no longer a small entity struggling in the corner of the earth. You're part of this whole humanity.
Don't think this was an illusion. You saw it on TV, tens of thousands of Tahrir Square, freedom, solidarity, and in a way you could directly identify with it. I think it was a genuine, universal event, immediately understandable. And you know what is crucial? This is not the boring UNESCO universalism, this boring books, Weltkultur, and this culture is great, that culture is great. No, as every true universality, it's a universality of struggle.
In this world there's room for everyone. The good earth is rich and can provide for everyone. The way of life can be free and beautiful, but we have lost the way. Greed has poisoned men's souls, has barricaded the world with hate, has goose-stepped us into misery and bloodshed. We have developed speed, but we have shut ourselves in. Machinery that gives abundance has left us in want. Our knowledge has made us cynical, our cleverness hard and unkind. We think too much and feel too little. More than machinery, we need humanity. More than cleverness, we need kindness and gentleness. Without these qualities, life will be violent, and all will be lost.
Американская фирма Transceptor Technology приступила к производству компьютеров «Персональный спутник».
How many fingers am I holding out? 4. But if the state says not 4, but 5, how many? 4. Take him.
Every case of police
cut it after that.
against a Negro follows the same pattern. They attack you, bust you all upside your mouth, and then take you to court and charge you with assault. What kind of democracy is that? What kind of freedom is that? What kind of social or political system is it when a black man has no voice in court, has nothing on his side other than what the white man chooses to give? My brothers and sisters, we have to put a stop to this. And it will never be stopped until we stop it ourselves.
So this goes on it's a 40-minute piece. So it's a long narrative that's based on, I mean, for me, it was a way of looking at all the different questions that were raised as the events were unfolding on the ground, and to kind of address this kind of archetypal need for revolt and quest for freedom that every generation has and every culture has. Whoops. Then I moved here into the rule of the Muslim Brotherhood, but it's also kind of mixed with what's happened also with the rule of the SCAF, which was the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, the army, and very much focused on, there was a huge amounts of questions and issues in that period, but there was a very clear kind of war on women. Here there's this wall that was built by the army. The whole of Cairo around Tahrir was just avenues going down from Tahrir and blocked by these massive blocks of cement, which of course the demonstrators destroyed very easily and very often. But a lot of battles happen, and this is a very sad place, the Mohammed Mahmoud Street, which then becomes the kind of street where all the revolutionaries, graffitis, artists have painted all the portraits of the martyrs and the kind of overlay stories of the battles of the revolution. So this graffiti is, there's flowers for all the people who died, but the graffiti is from the football teams that were very much the supporters of the revolution, and it basically says "El Horeya Gaya Labud," which is in Arabic, freedom is coming, but there's a kind of emphasis on the fact that there is no, it's a certain thing that freedom is coming. And so I used this to title a piece that I did in metal and leather. So I went back to kind of making a sculpture, and I basically built a chastity belt, quite giant size chastity belt. And I'm showing these photos because I think it's quite amusing to see this machine that laser cuts metal. And while I was doing the work, that place was managed by this group of Salafis, which is a very, very, very traditional kind of and fundamentalist group of Muslims. So I of course, wasn't going to tell them I'm doing a chastity belt. So they asked, what is it you're doing? So I said, I'm doing a gate. And so they were really curious. They didn't know what it was. But the funny thing was that this machine is a $1 million machine. So when you think about like this kind of like, this object that cost a fortune, that has a diamond to kind of, laser cut this metal. But then when I get the piece that I made, this is how we go back to the workshop and bring it back in a kind of medieval kind of way, and kind of also medieval political environment that we were in at the time. And this is the workshop where I'm doing the lock for the chastity belt. And here you see the actual piece finished and shown in an exhibition in France in 2013. In a funny way, where it was originally created as chastity belts were pretty much medieval European invention, and this one was actually inspired by a 17th century French chastity belt. So there was also this whole sense of, again, history repeating itself, or the resonance between different periods and so on. And here it's shown in ZKM, which is Center for Media and Technology. So it's quite a funny place to show an object that's so raw. Following this object, I took the counterpoint of the chastity belt and worked back with the archive and with this environment in which we were, that was really, really offensive, aggressive towards women, as people were really, there was no police and there was no army doing anything. They were just leaving the brotherhood sort of do their thing. And there was a very, very clear kind of political tool being used, that was to rape and to sexually harass women in the streets so they could go back home. And so up to now, there is about 2,516, or I don't know exactly the number, but that kind of number of women that have reported being sexually harassed or raped. So let alone the ones who haven't. I wanted to show another side to respond to the situation in a very different way. And so this image is a still from an installation in 2013 in Paris at the Grand Palais, where I was commissioned by Christian Dior, the haute couture designer, to do a work inspired by Miss Dior. And Miss Dior happened to be an activist who had been arrested during the Second World War, and who, a resistant more than an activist. And when she came out of the concentration camps, her brother created a dress for her, and then later a perfume. So she's really like the sort of icon of Christian Dior. And also it was interesting that this woman actually had this kind of political loaded history. And so I collected, as a branching out from my archive, I collected like 500 videos of women from the early century, the 20th century, from early cinema to like more or less the 50s, that were really focused on the liberation of women, but also that had changed something in the fields they were working in, or images in films that represented the role of a woman of a certain kind. And so the screen you see is 180 degrees. You're surrounded by it, and the sound is a surround sound system. So there are 7 speakers, 5 across the screen in front and 2 behind. So the whole time, every character that comes into the image sort of feels like the presence of it is very clear in the sound. And the work is not to be looked at as a video, as a narrative, but much more as an immersive kind of environment and mood that you become part of. So here there's a, I'm not sure how long this is, but we can start. You have to imagine it's 10 meters by 3, which I'm not sure how to convert in inches, but it's 2.5 the size of a human being high and pretty long. So you can never see the whole thing at once. You have to constantly turn your head left or right. So in a space, you see every single character is very in detail, of course. This is very reduced. So in the space, of course, she looks like she's coming back behind you and so on. So this is an 8-minute piece. So I'm not going to show you the whole thing, but you have to just imagine that you're immersed in it. Or maybe after that, since it's pretty beautiful. Voila. This is the Muslim Brotherhood period. It was like my way of saying no. And today we're back to a military regime, which I thought I would illustrate with this quite Baladi image, because my name means kitsch, and we were talking about the meaning of it. So it means trouble in Danish, but which I just found out today. So we're back to a military regime, and it feels like we can't do very much. I mean, there is a very policed country, and anybody who tries to even conglomerate with more than 2 or 3 people gets tear gassed immediately and arrested and so on. And there isn't anymore the possibility to kind of go to the streets as we did, or obviously that has its limits as what it can do, and so it feels a little bit, and I'm talking for a lot of people in the in terms of activists and NGOs and people who have participated in the revolution, that the work that is really being done at the moment is archiving and making sure that at least that period doesn't disappear, doesn't get censored, as it already has been very much so, and also that it gets recorded and in some cases, those records do constitute an actual political tool and a potential political power against the regime. So this is the kind of moment we're in, where archiving is a kind of, taking a step back, but archiving becomes a very important way of resisting. So I know archiving sounds sometimes a little bit, like maybe boring because it's about organizing and putting things away and so on, but I think it's very important to also see how archiving has had so many different lives and how there are ways to deal with archive. And Halsey's presentation earlier today was really amazing in that way, that it allows the platform he developed really allows for stories to continue to exist and to remain alive. And so the work I'm doing here today, which is here is a sort of like first kind of iteration of possibilities and how data kind of dialogues with itself, is very much trying to do, originally it was one big project. I think it always is, but the way to construct it is really to kind of divide it into sub-projects so that it can actually get somewhere and start to exist and manifest itself. So my vision of it is to influence by this big painting and this street where all these graffiti artists have painted the revolution over and over and over again. The Mohammed Mahmoud Street, where you saw also the wall built by the army earlier, is very much what, and the amount of documentation digitally that exists, this kind of two for me constitutes the kind of inspiration for creating what I call a transmedia painting, where data is orchestrated in a way that it communicates with itself and it can be read and interacted with. And so that while it is an artistic interpretation of a timeline of the revolution in a very visual and very aesthetic, with a choice of an aesthetic that is very much the way that the people have responded and created and produced material on the revolution. So I focused my archive on Vox Populi, which is the title of the work, and on how this, everybody became a kind of video artist overnight and produced material that was uploaded regularly or created very funny kind of jokes or slogans or animation. I mean, all kinds of material came out of it. And so this idea of creating, while creating an installation that really invites people into reading the timeline as one timeline rather than as a day-to-day relationship to an event, and also give them the ability to add their own commands and annotation to this, what I call the biography of our memory. It's also been very exciting to be here because there is, and I thank MIT for that, because it's given me the real access to so many different levels and questions that are related to my project. So not just the technological application to making an artwork or telling a story, but also the understanding of the political context in which all these things happen and the issues that are raised suddenly when you start creating a project like this that involves the internet, that involves security, that involves the need for protection of an archive, the need for protection of people that are involved in the archive, the legal aspects, the ethical aspects, and all these other questions. So these are like, I could go on and on and on about them. And to start this massive idea and like, where do I go and how do I start it, I was extremely lucky to meet students and faculty between MIT and Harvard, and two of them are here. So I have Joseph here, and who's created the Doc Shop, which is a group of students and faculty that sort of incubate a project in the context of a university. And Halsey, who's one of also my colleague at OpenDocLab, who's contributed to using the sound, the sound archive from the archive I've collected on the revolution. And together we made, at the end of last semester, an event. We created an event that was whose objective was really to just present the idea. So rather than doing a slideshow like I'm doing here, I wanted to bring people into the archive, into the idea in a very rudimentary way, in a very rough kind of draft, and just open a very open conversation about, how do you feel about this? Does it mean anything to you? Is there anything I should focus on? What are the possibilities? Are there other people interested in working with us on this project, and so on and so forth? So the Notes from Milsaneia was the first, in a way, the event zero of an iteration of possibilities of how to stage this archive. But while staging this archive, proposing a sort of conversational space, as well as inviting people into the process of, oops, I went backwards, into the process of creating art, and to each event elaborate on the aspects of the project until this data becomes actually orchestrated in the way that I have in my head. So these are other stills from the event where you see tweets from the revolution projected on printed photographs. And I'll pass that, and that's it. And thank you very much.